the slides and ideas fairly quickly since there are some good things that I think the group talked about. In particular, I think both Natalie and Brenna did a great job of defining and helping us to make sense of culture and helping us to think about how culture and communication are practiced in unique ways, right? So culture is something that feels really different to us depending on things such as our nationality, our background, right? How we greet each other, the topics we consider appropriate to talk about. This example from Korean societies in which oftentimes older people eat first, right, is another really interesting application of this issue as well. So I'm going to just have that a quiz question that's available for you to access later on Canvas. This just talks about different approaches to uncertainty reduction theory, so you can use this as another question to help you in preparation for the midterm. One thing I wanted to let you know as well about is that I'll be posting a study guide for the midterm exam along with some practice questions by Wednesday. I actually got a question or two about if you want feedback on the question that you did last week, or you want to try it again and send a typed version or something like that and would like feedback on it, I'm happy to send you feedback on that question. Just let me know through email. When we get to Wednesday's class, I'll be posting some practice short essay questions. And if you would like me to give feedback to you on those to get a sense of how that answer would look on the midterm, I'm willing to do that too. So last class, right, we had on Friday a short essay question that I asked you to complete. It was talking about some of the key differences between verbal and nonverbal communication, such as the ways that verbal communication is oftentimes clear, nonverbal is more ambiguous, right? It has meaning that we don't necessarily understand every time. We also did some group work talking about the Sapiens reading, about the challenges of communicating remotely, right? When you're on the small screen on Zoom, it's a lot harder for us to communicate with each other and understand a lot of our nonverbal cues. Today, we had our discussion leaders talk about culture. I want to use a couple more examples to think about how culture is distinct and some of the approaches that we can use to better understand them. I really liked how the partnership as well were able to focus a lot on defining culture and understanding different types of culture, right? I want to focus as well on some of the norms and rules that we can use to shape culture. So, right, the group members did a great job of defining culture, and we can think about culture in terms of our memberships, our groups that we're a part of and that help us to make us who we are, right? So if you're on a sports team, a lot of the jargon and terminology that you might use, you might talk about your team's defensive lineup, right? And so on might be unique. You also develop these kind of informal rules and norms as well. When I did competitive speech and debate, right, every time we go to a tournament, we do these very silly vocal warm-ups, right? And we develop this oral history over time where by being a part of this team, we would share different warm-ups from previous teammates and over time just develop this oral history, which was a lot of fun and a way to get group members in on the topic, right? So culture is a group of people. It's not a solo effort, right? You cannot be your own culture, although, right, you have a culture within you. We learn and develop culture over time. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens through generations, through stories and traditions being passed down. It shapes perceptions of the world, right? So you can think about perceptions as the glasses that you wear or the filter that you use to understand the world, right? So I have a blue light filter on my glasses, so everything is tinted in a slightly different way. So the same way, right, the way that you look at the world, the way that you make sense of reality is going to look really different depending on the things you believe in. For example, if you believe in karma, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. That's going to shape your belief that you yelling at your parents last night impacted you getting a flat tire the next day. Also, right, it influences our beliefs, values, norms, and rules. So the group did a great job of starting this discussion. I want to pick a little bit more on some of these parts. and they affect our behavior, right? So behavior is a really big component of culture. Culture is this constant doing. That is, as a member of a culture, you're doing language, you're practicing kind of rituals and traditions. So for instance, if your family has a unique way of celebrating a particular holiday, maybe it's a way of celebrating, if you're lighting a menorah, you're putting presents under a Christmas tree, right? That can vary depending on your cultural identity and the way that you share those experiences. So when it comes to breaking down these different elements that make up a culture, we have what are considered beliefs. So what is true about the world? How is the world? So you might think about a religion or spiritual group. Do they believe in a God? Do they believe in multiple gods, right? How they interpret and make sense of that experience might impact their beliefs. Additionally, values, right? So a value can be either terminal or instrumental. Think about an instrumental value as an instrument, a means to an end. So in other words, you might value money because money can help you to secure your family. Whereas terminal value is an end of itself. You might value family for its own sake. You care about those close to you and so on. So a means to an end versus an end of itself is one way of thinking about values. In terms of a lot of political and social differences we see in the United States, oftentimes this comes about because we view different values as more or less important than each other. One example of this, right, you might have seen today in the news headlines that Colin Powell, former U.S. Secretary of Defense under the Bush administration, passed away. He was kind of a major part of the Bush administration's approach to the war on terror, was famous for giving a speech to the United Nations talking about the need for invasion in Iraq, right? One of the major conflicts and areas where values differed at the time was a discussion of the U.S. Patriot Act. Patriot Act 2001 allowed for greater kind of wiretapping and surveillance of things like our communication, our phone calls, our texts, and so on. And one of the big value debates that happened, and is still ongoing, right, is this question of freedom versus security, two very different values, right? Freedom, this idea that we should be free to express our opinions and share without this concern about our material being traced or tracked. Security and the threats that things such as terrorism or non-state actor violence might have, and the degree to which our material should be monitored in order to secure our safety, right? So that's an ongoing debate, competition amongst values that we continue to see. We also have norms, right? Norms are these kind of informal rules. So partnership brought up things such as, who eats first and last at the dinner table, right? Those aren't written or hard-coded. Those aren't things that, there's like not a rule book, but these are guidelines and things that we incorporate into our lives, whereas rules are these hard-coded things. So rule might be something like, don't put your hands outside of the bus while it's moving, right? So rule is this really clear way to define things. One way to kind of break down this as well is if you're familiar with some of the indigenous tribes and groups in the area, so kind of around Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington, right? The Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people have this kind of shared reservation in space. And one area where they align in terms of belief in both Columbia River and Blue Mountains as a source of things like food and resources, right? It's a crucial part of how many members of these groups survive. There's a strong value in culture and ancestry, right? The idea of stories and experiences being passed down through generations is being really important. Some norms might include the use of dance, the washa, or seven drums religion that's shared among many members of some of these tribes and groups. And then the rules. So one thing that members of some of these tribes are developing is actually a language program to help many current members to learn the native languages that have kind of faded over time and become less widely practiced and used. The idea here being that because language is such a crucial part of many of these groups' identities, the ability to continue to practice these languages is important. You can think back to muted group theory in the class as an example of this, right? Muted group theory being that dominant cultures tend to dictate the language that we can use. This is in many ways pushing back against this because a lot of the indigenous tribes and groups want to reaffirm their own languages and share that to new generations. Right? So I like the video I used at the beginning of class to break up different components of culture. One way you can think about this is, right, if culture is a big circle or a big blob, a co-culture kind of exists within that, right? Co-cultures have significant impact on society. So one way to interpret or make sense of a culture is, for instance, American, right? You could interpret American nationality as a culture, although not everybody does or sees it as a super strong part of their cultural identity. But within, right, American, there's a very large variety of ways that that cultural identity could be expressed, right? So for instance, within the culture of American, the lived experiences of many members of the African American community, the Asian or Pacific Islander community, the experiences of a variety of different racial, ethnic, and so on groups exist within that broader umbrella, but express and deal with a very different set of lived experiences, right? Many publications, including Netflix, have done a thing where they've spotlighted like Black American voices and media, and those are ways of us understanding a co-culture or different set of shared experiences within that larger group, right? Additionally, a microculture is even smaller than that, and is usually tied to a specific location. So for instance, microculture could be something like, within a broader culture of American football, something like football at Eastern Oregon University. Right? It divides up this broader category into a kind of instance or group. A chapter of something like major organization or club could be an example of that too. Another idea that I want to bring up here is this role of self-esteem and how it ties into a group, right? You might recall earlier in the class, we had the difference between self-image and self-esteem. Self-image is just how you view yourself, whereas self-esteem is very much making a judgment about whether or not you see yourself as a good or a bad person. And in the same way, we use our membership in cultures and groups as a way to define ourselves and our own value. So there's these 4 different ways to help us make sense of that. So say you're on a football team, right? You might start out with this idea of private collective esteem. That is, how do you feel about the group? Maybe you feel really included and a big part of it. Maybe you don't like the group very much. So maybe you started a new sport at EOU, you feel like you don't know your teammates very well, or like you don't fit in, and maybe you don't have a super positive impression. Or maybe you've been a member of this group for a while, and you have really close and good friendships there. That dictates your private collective esteem, how you view the group. You also have this idea of a membership esteem. It's how you feel like you fit in the group. There are so many, again, like teen movies and TV shows, ones like Mean Girls, where you have all the different cliques and groups that people are part of, right? Do you fit in? Do you feel like you're a member of whatever group you associate with? That's oftentimes the major plot point in a lot of these shows and movies, right? We like to feel like we're valued and included and can contribute to the group. Public collective esteem is how non-members feel. So what is the reputation of your group? Is it, for instance, a sport team that's getting a lot of headlines, a lot of respect? Is it an extracurricular or club that is doing some really cool stuff, but maybe isn't getting as much attention? Do you have a bad reputation amongst your group, right? Those can be things that you can think about a lot. And then lastly, how important is this culture or group to who you are and how you identify as a person? One thing that was kind of interesting was, in my morning class, a lot of people, when they were using words to describe themselves, put things like athlete really early on. They were like, yeah, I'm an athlete, right? I noticed in this class, when some people did that, a lot more folks put other words to describe themselves before that. So how important being part of a group, an activity, a club, or something like family, ethnic, or national culture, right, is to you is going to be this part here, how important that is to your identity as a whole. So we use these things to evaluate ourselves in relationship to the cultures that we're a part of. So we might associate with a variety of different cultures, both in terms of our family, our nationality, our heritage, and so on, and use those constant evaluations every day. We also know, right, that there's challenges with stereotypes. One of the classic examples being when you're assigned gender at birth, right, the way that blue is associated with masculine, pink associated with feminine. When I was younger, like 3 or 4, I started playing with Barbie doll. My sister said, don't do that. You're not supposed to, right? We're oftentimes socialized and stereotypes are used to tell us how we should or shouldn't behave. Stereotypes can be felt at both kind of this cultural and personal level, right? A cultural stereotype is a stereotype held toward a group at large. Right, a lot of times when we experience things such as racism, we see directed toward a culture or group, the use of slurs, insults, and so on. But it can also be directed toward a person, right? So a personal stereotype is to say, this person, by virtue of being a member of this culture or group, is XYZ, right? As humans, we like to make patterns. We like to form relationships between ideas. And unfortunately, that can lead to things like stereotypes, right? You might also think about the use of language and its, for instance, gender components, right? You hear the word flight attendant, and you might assume the gender of flight attendant as being female on the basis of cultural stereotypes that we might have, right? So one of the challenges then that emerges is this idea of ethnocentrism, right? Birds of a feather flock together. We tend to feel more comfortable with cultures that are part of our lives and that we more closely associate with. And one challenge that can happen as a result of that is us believing that our own culture or cultures are better than other cultures, right? That's something we have to constantly try to question and push back against. Ethnocentrism prevents us from understanding other cultures as well and being able to support and listen to the perspectives of other people, right? If we think our culture is the best, then we tend to ask others to conform to our way of living rather than to respect and understand the perspectives of other people. So one idea here is context. This is a table in your book. You don't need to copy down for today, but it's available for you to access later. One idea is low versus high context, right? The video from the partnership brought this up really well. Low context is you say what you mean, right? There's very little nonverbal communication or subtext. It's very explicit and clear. Whereas high context cultures tend to have more nonverbal communication and more kind of subtleties in communication. So for instance, in a country like Japan, typically rather than saying no, you might say yes, or maybe kind of hesitantly, you might look off to the side, and so on. So depending on the culture, there can be some pretty big differences in how identity is expressed. And in terms of nationality, right, there's this figure here talking about how there's the difference between low and high context. Another key idea here is the idea of face and saving face, right? Dr. Stelling Toomey put together this idea of face work, especially in more collectivist cultures in which people work together, right? The role of our reputation and face is really important. That is, we constantly put on a face in our relationships and as members of a culture to maintain things such as respect or civility with other people. And so face work is this idea of negotiating and managing our reputations with other people. So for instance, maybe you spilled water on somebody and you're really embarrassed, you're apologetic at the time, and you might come across as very ashamed or you avoid them in the future. We do things to try to preserve our collective self-esteem and how we feel in fitting in with members of the group. So we've talked a little bit about low versus high context. We've also talked in the class about individualism versus collectivism, right? An individualistic culture is one that's focused on personal achievement, whereas a collectivistic culture is one that tends to be focused more on the achievement of the group. But there are some other spectrums that we can use to define and contrast different cultures in terms of how they communicate. And what I'd like us to do is break up into groups and have us take a look at these. So what I'd like you to do is with your defined spectrum, maybe think about in your own words what this spectrum is. So what does it mean for a culture to be one or the other, to be low or high context? Using examples to show each extreme, right? So we might say an example of a low context culture is Britain, high context is something like China. And then write your group names on the paper or type that up to turn in, one per group. So let's have the front row up here focus on masculinity versus femininity. Let's have the second row here focus on low versus high, uncertainty avoidance. Row number 3, let's have you 3 focus on long versus short-term orientation. And the group in the back, indulgence versus restraint. So again, define this in your own words and think of an example each side of the spectrum.
Masculine and femininity, it's like what you associate like boys or males to be like doing and liking, and what you associate females to be doing and liking. Yeah. And then example would be blue and pink, which was like what you talked about, but like yeah. And sports. Like long.
The culture I thought of was like the Arab and Muslim culture, especially like extremist side of things, like women have tied on, while men like full power.
Yeah. Whereas in the U.S. right now it's all about like like girl power, so that's like obviously really different cultures.
Yeah, what's up?
What you associate.
Yeah, if you can. Just one per group is fine. Make sure you've got everybody with their names on it. Doesn't need to be super long, just enough that you can share in a couple minutes.
I'd say most of the time in American culture, somebody asks you how you doing, you say you're doing badly. The other person's gonna be like, oh wow, this person is sharing a lot of other stuff right now.
And then I feel like interests and hobbies usually are different, like, right? Yeah.
Right. So, first do you think?
Did you what? Example, what country did you say that?
I was just in like Muslim Arab, like extreme side of things.
You would write down that one where it's like limited female power.
Because like, if you think about the versus culture of being organized versus regular, everybody at first is so awake all the time, and they like ask you a lot of questions, and like they're always laughing really loud and shit. Like it's very different than how they're not, right? They're not just usually pretty quiet. Oh, you just, I guess that mostly women go there, so that I am part of not
So go ahead and wrap up. You're currently working on. Again, I'm just curious to hear just a major example and how you kind of defined this in your own words. So let's talk here, front group on masculinity versus femininity. So how did you define this and what did you find in terms of examples?
We defined it as like what you associate males and females to be like commonly liking and doing.
Uh-huh.
And so, like a lot of times their interests differ and they have, like a lot of times you imagine them with like different jobs, like kind of how we talk about firemen. When someone says fireman, you almost immediately think of a man.
Right.
And then what JP brought up was like in like Muslim and Arabic cultures, that a lot of times women don't really have any power or access to education or jobs, and like men hold authoritative positions.
Sure.
And that's like a lot different than what is in the U.S. or considered equal in the U.S.
Yeah, good examples. Second row here on uncertainty avoidance.
So you were sort of talking about how uncertainty avoidance is like how much you try to learn going into a situation so you can avoid like guessing about what's going on. So like in the United States and France, it's both very like generally private, like cultures don't talk a lot about yourself. Oversharing is seen as like super taboo in both cultures. And then in a group like gay culture, like talking to somebody about your emotions and your experiences is super normal, and you do that when you first meet another person in the community.
Yeah. Long versus short-term orientation.
So long-term orientation is when you're focused on the future, and short-term orientation is when you're focused on the present or past, and consider them more important than the future. So for a long-term example, we found that Honda is in Japan and the U.S. And Japan is very long-term oriented, so the employees work to build their future and the company's future and their long-term financial needs right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And then lastly, indulgence versus restraint.
Well, what we got was indulgence stands for a society that allows free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to enjoying life and having fun. And restraint stands for a society with strict social norms.
Yeah. So these are some really good examples and applications, right? Masculinity versus femininity is not just the genders of people in a culture, but also how different cultures define gender, right? Depending on the culture or group, what behaviors, clothing, and so on are defined as a gender can look really different. And obviously, identities outside of the kind of spectrum or binary here can be impacted too. Uncertainty avoidance, right, is uncertainty reduction theory. How comfortable are we with relationships we don't know? Our time orientation, right, are we future or present oriented matters? And then indulgence versus restraint. How much do we control our communication through society? So to wrap up for today, culture, right, is these unique experiences shared by members of a group. It relates to communication in a lot of ways in terms of how we share different parts of our cultures and identities, and, right, how we value ourselves as members of a culture. So So we'll continue this discussion next class. We only have like 5 readings, but we'll talk a little bit more about how we communicate across different cultures as well. The study guide will also be available on Wednesday. So thank you again. Natalie and Brenna did a great job of starting us off for today. I am turning off the projector right now so you don't get any more white noise. Otherwise, I hope that you have an awesome rest of your Monday, and I will see you again on Wednesday.